I woke up at 2 in the morning to 17 missed calls and my phone buzzing frantically against the nightstand. I'd been bedridden with the flu for 3 days, barely able to lift my head without the room spinning. My bank app showed multiple large transactions I never made. Security footage from the convenience store down the street showed my 20-year-old brother Ryan using my debit card to buy hundreds of dollars worth of gift cards and expensive electronics. When I confronted my mother Carol about the theft, she immediately defended him, saying he was just a kid making mistakes. That's when I dropped the bombshell that would change everything forever. My name is B, and for the past 4 years, I've worked as a financial care coordinator for Golden Years Senior Services here in our small Ohio town. It's not the most glamorous job, but it's meaningful work that I genuinely love. I help elderly clients who need assistance managing their day-to-day finances when they're no longer able to handle everything themselves. Some have early-stage dementia, others have mobility issues, and a few just feel overwhelmed by modern banking technology. My current primary client is Dorothy Williams, an 83-year-old widow whose family lives all the way across the country in California. Dorothy is one of the sweetest people I've ever met. With silver hair she keeps perfectly curled and a laugh that could light up any room. She has early-stage dementia, which means she has good days and bad days, but she's still completely capable of living independently with just a little extra support. Dorothy trusts me completely. Her daughter Sarah, who's a lawyer in Los Angeles, interviewed me extensively before agreeing to let me help her mother. Dorothy gave me access to her checking account so I could handle her groceries, utilities, medication, co-pays, and other daily expenses when she gets confused or forgetful. It's a huge responsibility, and I never take it lightly. I keep Dorothy's debit card in my wallet alongside my own for easy access during errands. Usually, I'm extremely careful about keeping our cards separated, but the night before I got sick, I'd visited Dorothy to help organize her weekly medications. She'd been having a particularly difficult day, getting confused about which pills to take when, and I'd spent extra time making sure everything was sorted correctly in her pill organizer. In my rush to get home that evening, I'd accidentally left Dorothy's card in my regular wallet instead of putting it back in my work folder like I normally do. It was an innocent mistake, the kind that happens when you're tired and focused on other things. My family knows all about my job and how important it is to me. My mom, Carol, has always been proud that I chose a career helping people, even if she doesn't always understand the details of what I do. My dad, Frank, is the quiet type who nods supportively but doesn't ask too many questions. And my brother, Ryan, well, he's always been the baby of the family, even though he's 20 years old now. Ryan still lives at home, working part-time at a local gaming store when he feels like showing up. He's completely obsessed with expensive gaming equipment and cryptocurrency, always talking about the next big investment that's going to make him rich. He has this frustrating habit of borrowing money from family members and then justifying it as temporary loans he fully intends to pay back, though somehow he never quite gets around to actually doing it. The past 3 days had been absolutely miserable. I'd caught some kind of flu bug that knocked me completely off my feet. I could barely get out of bed without feeling dizzy and nauseous. My mom had been bringing me soup and checking on me, which I appreciated, even though her hovering sometimes made me feel worse instead of better. When my phone started going crazy at 2 in the morning, my first thought was that something terrible had happened to someone in the family. But when I managed to focus my eyes enough to read the caller ID, I saw it was my bank's fraud department. My stomach dropped even before I answered the call. The representative on the phone was professional but concerned. They'd detected unusual activity on my account and wanted to verify several large transactions that had occurred throughout the day. As she read off the amounts and locations, I felt sicker than I already was. $300 at GameStop, $200 at Best Buy, $400 in Bitcoin ATM withdrawals, $150 at a liquor store downtown. I told the representative that I'd been homesick all day and hadn't made any of those purchases. She immediately flagged my account for fraud and told me I needed to file a police report. After hanging up, I opened my banking app with shaking hands and stared at the transactions in disbelief. Over $1,100 gone in a single day. That's when I noticed the security footage feature my bank had recently added. I clicked on the transaction at the convenience store, and there on my phone screen was crystal clear video of my brother Ryan using what was obviously my debit card to purchase gift cards and energy drinks. Despite feeling absolutely awful, I dragged myself out of bed and stumbled downstairs to confront my parents. They were both in the living room watching late-night television, and they looked surprised to see me up and moving around. When I showed them the bank transactions and the security footage, Ryan wasn't even home to defend himself. Mom immediately went into protective mode, the way she always did when Ryan was in trouble. She said I was overreacting, that he probably just needed some quick cash and figured I wouldn't mind since I always helped family out when they needed it. Dad stayed uncomfortably silent, which was typical for him whenever family drama erupted. He hated confrontation and usually just waited for things to blow over on their own. I tried to explain to Mom that this wasn't about helping family or lending money. This was theft. Taking someone's debit card without permission and spending over $1,000 wasn't borrowing, it was stealing. But she kept defending him, saying he was young and made mistakes, that family members should support each other instead of calling each other criminals. When Ryan finally came home around 3 a.m, he acted completely defiant. He admitted he'd taken my card but claimed he thought I wouldn't mind since I had a good job and always seemed to have money. He said he'd used the money to buy equipment for his streaming setup and invested in cryptocurrency that he was absolutely sure would make us all rich within a few months. The more he talked, the angrier I became. He genuinely seemed to believe that his get-rich-quick scheme justified stealing from me. When I told him the total amount he'd spent, his face went pale. He claimed he didn't keep track and thought it was maybe $200 or $300, not over $1,100. Mom still insisted that family should help family and that I should just loan Ryan the money anyway, since he was planning to pay me back with his crypto profits. That's when something inside me snapped, and I realized that my family had never truly respected me or my career. They saw me as the responsible one who should always sacrifice for others, especially for Ryan. But they had no idea what they were really asking me to sacrifice. The confrontation in our living room continued to escalate as Mom became more defensive and Ryan became more entitled. She kept insisting that I was being selfish and forgetting what family meant, while Ryan acted like I was ruining his life over pocket change. I tried to explain the financial reality to them. $1,100 wasn't pocket change to me. That money represented my entire rent payment plus utilities for the month. I lived paycheck to paycheck just like most people my age, and losing that much money all at once would mean I couldn't pay my bills. I'd have to ask my landlord for an extension, borrow money myself, or figure out some other way to cover my basic living expenses. Ryan seemed genuinely shocked when I broke down the numbers for him. His part-time job at the gaming store paid minimum wage, and he only worked about 20 hours a week when he felt like it. He had no concept of what it meant to be financially responsible for yourself, since Mom and Dad still covered his room and board, his car insurance, and most of his other expenses. Mom, however, doubled down on her position. She said that since I had a steady job and Ryan didn't, I should be willing to help him get ahead in life. She talked about how cryptocurrency was the future and how Ryan's investments could help the whole family if I just gave him a chance to prove himself. I was exhausted, sick, and increasingly frustrated with their complete inability to understand the seriousness of the situation. That's when I finally snapped and revealed the truth that would change everything. "You want to know the worst part?" I said, my voice shaking with anger and fever. "The card Ryan stole wasn't even mine." The room went completely silent. Mom's mouth fell open, and Ryan's face went from defiant to confused. "What do you mean it wasn't yours?" Mom asked quietly. "The debit card belongs to Dorothy Williams. She's 83 years old and she has early-stage dementia. I manage her finances as part of my job, and Ryan just stole over $1,100 from a vulnerable elderly woman who trusts me to protect her money." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Mom's face went white as she realized this wasn't just family drama anymore. Ryan sat down heavily on the couch, understanding for the first time that he'd committed a serious crime against someone who had nothing to do with our family. Dad finally spoke up for the first time all evening, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh my God, Ryan, what have you done?" I explained to them what my job actually involved, since they'd apparently never really understood it despite my talking about it for 4 years. I told them about the extensive background checks I'd gone through, the bonding and insurance requirements, the strict protocols for handling client funds. I explained that Dorothy's family had interviewed me extensively and that her daughter Sarah was a lawyer who took her mother's financial security very seriously. I could lose my job, I told them, my voice breaking. I could lose my professional license. I could face criminal charges for failing to protect my client's assets. Dorothy's family could sue me personally for negligence. The Senior Services Agency could face lawsuits and lose certification. I've worked 4 years to build trust with clients and colleagues, and Ryan just destroyed all of that in one day. Ryan was starting to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. This wasn't about borrowing money from his sister anymore. This was about stealing from a helpless elderly woman who depended on other people to protect her from exactly this kind of situation. Mom started crying, realizing that her unconditional defense of Ryan had blinded her to the serious legal and professional consequences we were now facing. She begged me to figure out a way to fix it without involving law enforcement or my employer. But I knew it was already too late for that. Dorothy would notice the money missing when she tried to buy groceries or pay bills. Her daughter Sarah checked the account regularly online from California. There was no way to hide what had happened or pretend it was just a family matter. As if on cue, my work phone started ringing. It was after 3 in the morning, but when I saw Dorothy's name on the caller ID, my heart sank. I knew this call would change everything. Dorothy's voice on the phone was small and frightened in a way that broke my heart. She'd gotten up early to go grocery shopping, trying to beat the crowds like she always did, but her card had been declined at the checkout. She was standing there with a full cart of groceries, embarrassed and confused, while other customers waited behind her. Honey, I don't understand what happened," she said, her voice trembling. "The cashier said there wasn't enough money in my account, but I know that can't be right. Sarah just deposited my Social Security check last week. I'm so embarrassed. Mrs. Peterson from next door had to come pick me up because I didn't know what else to do." I could hear the confusion and fear in her voice, and it made me want to crawl under a rock and disappear forever. Dorothy trusted me completely, and now she was experiencing exactly the kind of financial vulnerability that my job was supposed to protect her from. My family was watching me take the call, and I could see the reality of the situation finally sinking in for all of them. This wasn't an abstract victim they'd never meet. This was a real person with a name and a voice, someone who was scared and confused and didn't understand why her money was gone. "Dorothy, I'm so sorry this happened," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's been a problem with your account that I need to investigate immediately. Can you please stay home this morning while I figure out what happened? I'll bring you groceries myself later today." After hanging up, I looked at my family with tears streaming down my face. That's the woman Ryan stole from. She's 80, 3 years old, she has dementia, and she's terrified that someone is targeting elderly people in her neighborhood. She doesn't understand what happened to her money. Ryan buried his face in his hands. I could tell that hearing Dorothy's voice had made the situation real for him in a way that numbers on a screen couldn't. Mom was crying openly now, and Dad was pacing around the living room, running his hands through his hair. Despite feeling terrible from the flu, I knew I had to go to Dorothy's house immediately to assess the situation and figure out how to handle the crisis. I threw on clothes and drove across town, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I arrived at Dorothy's small ranch house, she met me at the door in her bathrobe, her usually perfectly curled hair flat and messy. She'd been crying, and it was obvious that she was having one of her bad days where the dementia made everything more confusing and frightening. "I don't understand what's happening, B," she said as she let me into her tidy living room. "I've been banking at the same place for 40 years. The cashier was so young, and she kept saying there wasn't enough money, but I know that can't be right. Do you think someone is stealing from old people in the neighborhood?" Mrs. Henderson down the street said her grandson warned her about scams targeting seniors. I had to lie to Dorothy in that moment, telling her there had been a bank error that I would resolve immediately. It felt like a betrayal of everything our relationship was built on, but I couldn't tell her the truth until I figured out how to handle the legal and professional aspects of what had happened. I stayed with Dorothy for an hour, helping her feel safe and reassuring her that her money was secure. I promised to bring her groceries that afternoon and to have everything sorted out by the next day. When I left her house, I felt like the worst person in the world. Back home, my family was waiting for me with a mixture of anxiety and desperation. Mom begged me to just put the money back from my own savings and not tell anyone what really happened. Ryan promised he'd sell all his gaming equipment to pay me back, though we all knew that would take weeks or months and wouldn't come close to covering the full amount. Dad suggested taking out a personal loan to replace the money immediately, but I had to explain to them that this wasn't just about replacing money. This was about breach of fiduciary duty and potential criminal charges. Even if we replaced every penny, I was still legally required to report the theft to my employer and potentially to law enforcement. That's when my phone rang again, and I saw an unfamiliar California number on the caller ID. My stomach dropped because I knew exactly who it was before I answered. "This is Sarah Williams, Dorothy Williams' daughter," the voice said crisply. "I regularly monitor my mother's account online, and I've noticed several large, suspicious transactions that occurred yesterday. I need to speak with you immediately about what appears to be theft from a vulnerable adult." Sarah was every bit the lawyer I'd expected her to be. She was sharp, direct, and immediately understood the legal implications of what had happened. She was furious and made it clear that she intended to contact the police and the senior services agency that morning. But there was something else in her voice that caught my attention. She mentioned that this incident gave her exactly what she needed to move forward with plans she'd been considering for her mother's care. "I've been telling my sister Jennifer for months that Mother needs to be in assisted living," Sarah said. "She's becoming too vulnerable living alone, and this proves it. I'll be flying out this week to start the process of moving her to a facility where she'll be properly supervised." That's when I realized the third devastating consequence of Ryan's theft. Not only had he stolen from an innocent elderly woman and potentially destroyed my career, but he'd also given Dorothy's family the justification they needed to take away her independence. Dorothy could lose her home, her autonomy, and her familiar surroundings because of what my brother had done. I hung up the phone and told my family about this additional consequence. Ryan was having what looked like a panic attack, finally understanding that his actions had far-reaching effects on people he'd never even met. Mom was alternating between crying and begging me to find some way to fix everything without involving authorities. But I knew there was no going back now. The damage was done, and we were going to have to face the consequences together. The next morning, despite still feeling sick, I had to report the theft to my supervisor at Golden Years Senior Services. Patricia Henderson had been my boss for all 4 years I'd worked there, and she'd always been supportive of my work. Walking into her office that day was one of the hardest things I'd ever had to do. Patricia's reaction was everything I'd feared it would be. She was shocked, disappointed, and immediately concerned about the implications for our entire program. Golden Years Senior Services was a small nonprofit organization that depended on community trust and support. A financial abuse scandal involving one of our coordinators could destroy years of reputation building and potentially shut down services for dozens of elderly clients. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," Patricia said after I explained the situation. "But you understand that I have no choice but to suspend you immediately pending a full investigation. We'll need to reassign all of your clients to other coordinators, and there will likely be an audit of every account you've had access to." The suspension meant immediate loss of income, which was devastating since I was already behind on bills because of Ryan's theft. But worse than the financial impact was knowing that I was losing the clients I'd worked so hard to help. Mrs. Patterson, who had mobility issues after hip surgery. Mr. Rodriguez, whose diabetes medications were complicated and expensive. Mrs. Chen, whose husband had died last year and who was still learning to manage finances on her own. All of these relationships that I'd built through patient, careful work were being destroyed. That afternoon, Detective Martinez called me to schedule an interview about the theft. He explained that elder financial abuse was a felony in our state, carrying penalties of up to 5 years in prison for first-time offenders. He made it clear that Ryan would likely face serious criminal charges, but he also indicated that I myself could face charges for negligence and failure to protect client assets. The legal reality was terrifying. Even though I was clearly a victim of theft by a family member, the fact that I'd left Dorothy's card accessible to others could be seen as professional negligence. If prosecutors decided to make an example of the case, I could face criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and the permanent loss of my professional license. Meanwhile, the situation at home was deteriorating rapidly. Mom blamed me for involving law enforcement, saying I should have handled everything privately within the family. She'd started drinking wine earlier in the day and was becoming increasingly emotional and irrational in her arguments. Ryan was alternating between panic attacks and episodes of defiant anger where he insisted everyone was overreacting. He'd disappear from the house for hours at a time, and when he came back, he'd either be sullen and withdrawn or aggressively defensive about his actions. Dad had essentially shut down completely. He was going through the motions of daily life but wasn't really present for conversations about the crisis. I could tell he was overwhelmed and didn't know how to handle the situation, so he was just pretending it wasn't happening. The stress was affecting everyone's health and relationships. Mom and Dad were barely speaking to each other. The house felt like a war zone where every conversation could explode into a screaming match. I was sleeping on the couch since I'd given up my apartment to save money, and the constant tension was making it impossible to recover from being sick. 3 days after the initial confrontation, I decided to search Ryan's room while he was out, looking for gaming equipment and other items he could sell to start paying restitution. What I found there completely changed my understanding of the situation. Hidden under his mattress, I discovered months' worth of bank statements showing online gambling transactions. Ryan had been gambling extensively for at least 6 months, losing thousands of dollars on sports betting websites and online poker. He'd maxed out 2 credit cards taking cash advances to fund his gambling, and there were printed emails showing that he owed money to several people. When I confronted him with the evidence that evening, the whole truth finally came out. Ryan's theft from Dorothy wasn't an impulsive decision or a misguided attempt to invest in cryptocurrency. It was a desperate attempt to pay gambling debts that had been growing for months. Ryan admitted that he'd been getting threatening messages from some of the people he owed money to, and he was genuinely scared about what would happen if he didn't pay them back. He'd been hiding the extent of his gambling addiction from the family, and the theft from Dorothy was his last resort attempt to buy himself more time. This revelation reframed everything we thought we knew about the situation. Ryan wasn't just irresponsible or entitled. He was suffering from a serious addiction and had gotten himself into genuinely dangerous situations. The theft from Dorothy was still inexcusable, but it was now clear that Ryan needed professional help for gambling addiction, in addition to facing criminal consequences for his actions. The discovery of Ryan's gambling addiction also explained some things that hadn't made sense before: his erratic work schedule at the gaming store, his secrecy about his finances, his mood swings and defensive behavior whenever anyone asked about money, the expensive cryptocurrency mining equipment he'd supposedly bought but that we'd never actually seen. Mom's reaction to learning about the gambling addiction was complicated. Part of her was relieved to have an explanation for Ryan's behavior that didn't make him seem like a heartless criminal. But she was also horrified to realize how much she'd missed about her son's problems and how much he'd been struggling without asking for help. Dad finally started engaging with the crisis in a meaningful way once he understood that Ryan had a genuine addiction. He'd struggled with alcohol dependency in his 20s, so he recognized the signs of addictive behavior and understood that punishment alone wouldn't solve the underlying problem. But even with this new understanding of Ryan's motivations, the legal and professional consequences remained the same. Dorothy had still been victimized, my career was still in ruins, and our family was still facing potential criminal charges and financial devastation. Over the following weeks, the consequences of Ryan's actions continued to spread throughout our community like ripples in a pond. News of the investigation spread quickly in our small Ohio town, where everyone knew everyone else's business. Other families who had elderly relatives receiving services from Golden Years Senior Services started questioning whether their loved ones were safe. I watched helplessly as my reputation in the community was destroyed almost overnight. Neighbors who had always been friendly suddenly avoided making eye contact when I passed them on the street. Former clients and their families looked at me with suspicion and disappointment. The local grocery store cashier, who had always been chatty and friendly, now processed my purchases in uncomfortable silence. The impact on Dorothy was particularly heartbreaking to witness. Her mental state deteriorated rapidly as the stress and confusion of the situation affected her dementia symptoms. She became suspicious of everyone around her and started hiding money in various places around her house, forgetting where she'd put it and then panicking about being robbed. Without my income from Golden Years Senior Services, I couldn't afford to keep my apartment. I'd been living paycheck to paycheck even before the crisis, and the loss of $1,100 combined with suspension from work made it impossible to pay rent. I had to give up my place and move back into my childhood bedroom at my parents' house, which created even more tension in an already explosive situation. Mom's drinking had escalated from occasional evening wine to starting before lunch most days. She was using alcohol to cope with the stress and shame of the situation, but it was making her more emotional and less rational in her responses to everything happening around us. She'd alternate between crying fits where she blamed herself for failing as a mother, and angry outbursts where she blamed me for destroying the family by not protecting Ryan from consequences. The financial strain on the family was becoming unbearable. We had to hire a criminal defense attorney for Ryan, which cost $15,000 that my parents didn't have. Dad took out a second mortgage on the family home, putting their retirement security at risk to pay legal fees. Mom lost her part-time job at the local library because her drinking and emotional instability were affecting her work performance. Ryan had disappeared for 2 entire days the previous week, causing panic that he might hurt himself or try to run away from his problems. When he finally came home, he revealed that he'd been to see the lawyer Dad had hired for him. The attorney had explained that Ryan was likely facing serious prison time and that the best-case scenario would involve a plea deal requiring full restitution, probation, and mandatory counseling. The stress of potentially losing their youngest child to the prison system was overwhelming for my parents. Dad started having chest pains that required a trip to the emergency room, though tests showed it was anxiety rather than heart problems. Mom's drinking increased to the point where I was genuinely worried about her health and safety. The situation seemed hopeless until something completely unexpected happened. Dorothy called me directly on a day when her mind was particularly clear and focused. Despite her dementia, she had moments of complete lucidity where she understood exactly what was happening around her. Dear, I need to tell you something important," Dorothy said when I answered her call. "I know what really happened with my money, and I don't blame you for what your brother did. You've been nothing but kind and helpful to me, and I won't let other people destroy your reputation over something that wasn't your fault." I was so surprised by her clarity and support that I started crying on the phone. Dorothy went on to explain that she'd been thinking clearly about the situation and wanted to help me fight the charges against my professional reputation. But then Dorothy delivered news that I hadn't expected. Her daughter Jennifer was flying in from New York that weekend, and she was furious with her sister Sarah for trying to use this situation to force Dorothy into assisted living. Jennifer and Sarah had been estranged for years over disagreements about their mother's care, with Jennifer believing that Dorothy should remain independent as long as possible. "Jennifer is a nurse practitioner," Dorothy explained, "and she understands better than Sarah what I'm actually capable of managing on my own. She's been looking for an excuse to challenge Sarah's power of attorney, and this situation has given her the opportunity she needed." This revelation completely changed the family dynamics around Dorothy's situation. Instead of being united in moving her to assisted living, Dorothy's daughters were now on opposite sides of a legal battle about her future care. Dorothy herself was choosing to ally with me and Jennifer against Sarah's attempts to control her life. Jennifer arrived that weekend and immediately scheduled a meeting with me. She was everything her sister Sarah wasn't: warm, practical, and focused on her mother's actual needs rather than her own convenience. She'd been a nurse for 15 years and specialized in geriatric care, so she understood better than anyone what Dorothy was and wasn't capable of managing. "My sister has been looking for an excuse to put Mom in assisted living for years," Jennifer told me during our meeting. "She thinks it's easier than providing the support Mom actually needs to stay independent. But I've seen the work you've done with Mom, and I know how much she trusts and depends on you." Jennifer proposed a plan that could benefit everyone involved. She wanted to move back to Ohio to be closer to her mother and provide more direct family support. She could supplement the services I provided through Golden Years Senior Services, creating a more comprehensive care network that would satisfy everyone's concerns about Dorothy's safety and independence. But for this plan to work, Jennifer needed my professional reputation to be restored and my job to be reinstated. She was willing to advocate strongly for me with both the Senior Services Agency and law enforcement, emphasizing that I was a victim of theft rather than a negligent employee. This unexpected alliance gave me the first real hope I'd felt since the crisis began. Dorothy's support meant everything to me personally, but Jennifer's professional expertise and legal advocacy could actually help rebuild my career and restore my reputation in the community. With Dorothy and Jennifer's support, I finally found the strength to stop protecting Ryan from the consequences of his actions. I'd been caught between wanting to help my brother and wanting to seek justice for Dorothy, but I realized that enabling Ryan's behavior wasn't helping anyone, including Ryan himself. I started cooperating fully with Detective Martinez's investigation, providing detailed evidence and testimony about the theft and its impact on both Dorothy and my professional life. I documented everything I could remember about Ryan's gambling addiction and the threats he'd mentioned receiving, building a complete picture for law enforcement of how the situation had developed. Through a nonprofit organization that helped victims of family financial crimes, I found a pro bono attorney who specialized in cases involving theft from vulnerable adults. Attorney Lisa Park understood both the legal complexities of my situation and the emotional difficulty of taking action against a family member. Lisa helped me navigate the process of appealing my suspension from Golden Years Senior Services. With Dorothy's written support and Jennifer's professional recommendation, we built a strong case that I was a victim of theft rather than a negligent employee who had failed in my duties. Patricia, my supervisor, had been reluctant to reinstate me while criminal charges were still pending, but she began to see the situation differently when Dorothy and Jennifer advocated for me personally. Several of my former clients also wrote letters supporting my character and professionalism, describing the positive impact my work had made in their lives. I also used this crisis as an opportunity to develop new security protocols that would prevent similar incidents in the future. I proposed changes to how client debit cards were stored and accessed, additional training for employees about protecting client assets, and regular audits to ensure proper handling of finances. These improvements showed that I was taking responsibility for my role in creating the vulnerability that Ryan had exploited. At home, I set firm boundaries with my family about my willingness to enable or protect Ryan. I told Mom directly that unconditional support wasn't love when it prevented someone from getting the help they needed. I explained that by protecting Ryan from consequences, she was actually preventing him from addressing his gambling addiction and taking responsibility for his actions. This boundary setting led to several explosive confrontations with Mom, who accused me of abandoning my brother when he needed family support the most. But I stood firm in my position, explaining that real love sometimes meant allowing people to face the natural consequences of their choices. Dad finally started supporting my position after weeks of remaining silent. He'd been doing his own research about gambling addiction and family-enabling behaviors, and he realized that the family's protective approach was actually part of the problem rather than part of the solution. The tension at home became so unbearable that I decided to move out permanently, even though it meant couch surfing with friends rather than having a stable place to live. I couldn't recover emotionally or professionally while living in the middle of constant family drama and guilt trips. Ryan's criminal case was moving forward despite the family pressure to drop charges or seek a private resolution. Detective Martinez explained that elder financial abuse cases were prosecuted aggressively in our county, and the district attorney's office wasn't willing to let the case disappear just because we were family members. But as Ryan's court date approached, we discovered information that completely changed our understanding of his gambling debts and the threats he'd been receiving. The investigation revealed that the people threatening Ryan weren't dangerous criminals like he'd claimed. They were actually other college students he'd been gambling with in private poker games, and the amounts he owed them were much smaller than he'd led us to believe. Ryan had been lying about the severity of the threats to gain sympathy and justify his desperate actions. He'd portrayed himself as a victim of dangerous loan sharks when the reality was much more mundane. He'd gotten in over his head with casual gambling among friends and had panicked when he couldn't pay his debts. The investigation also revealed that Ryan had been stealing money from other family members for the past year. He'd forged Mom's signature on a credit card application and had been making cash advances against her account. He'd also stolen prescription medication money that was supposed to go to our grandmother's care facility. When Mom discovered that Ryan had stolen from her own accounts and had put our 87-year-old grandmother at risk by taking her medication money, her protective attitude finally cracked. She realized that Ryan's problems were much deeper and more manipulative than she'd understood. The criminal defense attorney advised Ryan to accept a plea deal that included restitution, probation, and mandatory treatment for gambling addiction. The lawyer explained that going to trial would likely result in a harsher sentence and that accepting responsibility was the best path forward for everyone involved. Ryan finally began to understand that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond his own life. The theft from Dorothy, the impact on my career, the financial strain on our family, the stress, related health problems affecting our parents, all of these were direct results of choices he'd made over many months. For the first time since the crisis began, Ryan started taking genuine responsibility for his actions rather than looking for ways to minimize or excuse them. He agreed to plead guilty to the charges and to comply with all the requirements of his plea deal, including getting treatment for his gambling addiction. 6 months after that horrible night when my phone rang with fraud alerts, our family's life looked completely different. Ryan's legal case had been resolved through a plea agreement that held him accountable while giving him the opportunity to rebuild his life in a healthier way. Ryan pleaded guilty to elder financial abuse and fraud charges, receiving 2 years of probation with strict conditions. He was required to complete 300 hours of community service, attend weekly gambling addiction counseling, and pay full restitution to Dorothy plus court costs. The judge made it clear that any violation of his probation terms would result in immediate jail time. To meet the restitution requirements, Ryan had to get a second job at a local restaurant in addition to his hours at the gaming store. He sold all of his expensive gaming equipment and used his entire savings account to start paying back what he owed. The payment plan would take him almost 2 years to complete, but he was making steady progress and seemed genuinely committed to making things right. The community service requirement turned out to be particularly meaningful for Ryan's recovery. The judge assigned him to work at Sunset Manor, a local assisted living facility where he helped with activities and spent time with elderly residents. Being around seniors every week helped Ryan understand the real impact of elder financial abuse and gave him perspective on the vulnerability he'd exploited when he stole from Dorothy. My professional situation had improved dramatically with Dorothy and Jennifer's advocacy. Golden Years Senior Services reinstated me after I completed additional training on financial security protocols and agreed to work with a supervisor for 3 months to rebuild confidence in my abilities. The agency adopted the new security measures I'd proposed, and I became something of a spokesperson in the community for elder financial protection. Patricia offered me a promotion to a supervisor position with increased responsibility for training other coordinators and developing policies to protect clients. The irony wasn't lost on me that the worst crisis of my career had ultimately led to opportunities for greater impact and leadership. My reputation in the community was slowly being restored as people learned the full story of what had happened. Dorothy's public support had been crucial in helping people understand that I was a victim of family theft rather than a negligent employee. Several new clients specifically requested to work with me because they'd heard about how I'd fought to protect Dorothy even when it meant taking action against my own brother. Dorothy's situation had stabilized beautifully with Jennifer's return to Ohio. Jennifer found a job at the local hospital and moved into a small apartment just 10 minutes from her mother's house. She provided daily family support while I continued handling financial coordination, creating the comprehensive care network that Dorothy needed to maintain her independence. Sarah had eventually accepted her sister's return and Dorothy's choice to remain in her own home. The family conflict had been resolved through mediation, with both daughters agreeing to respect their mother's wishes about her living situation as long as appropriate support services remained in place. Dorothy's mental clarity had improved significantly once her stress decreased and her daily routine stabilized. She'd started a support group for other elderly people who'd experienced financial abuse, sharing her story and helping others understand that they weren't alone in facing these challenges. The family dynamics at home had also shifted dramatically through months of counseling and hard work. Mom had entered treatment for her drinking problem and was attending therapy to address the enabling behaviors that had contributed to Ryan's problems. She was learning to show love through accountability rather than unconditional protection. Dad had become much more engaged with family decisions and was no longer avoiding difficult conversations. He'd taken early retirement to focus on his health and to be more present for the family's recovery process. The 4 of us were attending family therapy together once a week, working to rebuild relationships based on honesty and healthy boundaries, rather than the dysfunctional patterns that had enabled Ryan's addiction and theft. I'd found my own apartment again, a small but comfortable place where I could maintain my independence while staying connected with my family's healing process. I'd also started dating someone I'd met through work, a social worker named David who understood the importance of my career and respected the boundaries I'd learned to set. Ryan had begun speaking at high school assemblies about gambling addiction and the consequences of financial crimes. His counselor had suggested that sharing his story could help both his own recovery and prevent other young people from making similar mistakes. These speaking engagements were voluntary, but Ryan found them meaningful and continued doing them even after fulfilling his community service requirements. The most meaningful moment of the entire ordeal came on a sunny spring afternoon when I was helping Dorothy plant flowers in her garden. She was having one of her particularly clear days, and we were enjoying the peaceful work of preparing her yard for the growing season. "You know, dear," Dorothy said as she carefully placed marigold seedlings in the rich soil, "sometimes the worst things that happen to us teach us who really loves us. Your brother made a terrible mistake, but you fought for what was right even when it was hard for your family. That takes real courage." As we worked together in the warm sunshine, Ryan arrived for his weekly community service visit at Sunset Manor next door. He waved to us from across the yard, and Dorothy waved back with genuine warmth. She'd forgiven him completely while still holding him accountable for making things right. "He's a good boy who made bad choices," Dorothy continued, "but he's working to fix what he broke, and that's what matters now. You taught him that love means expecting better from people, not accepting less." Watching Ryan walk into the assisted living facility to spend time with elderly residents, I felt a deep sense of peace about the path our family had taken. It had been painful to hold him accountable, but it was the most loving thing I could have done for everyone involved. The crisis had taught all of us that real family love means supporting each other's growth and healing, not enabling destructive behavior. Trust could be rebuilt through consistent actions and genuine change, but it required the courage to demand better from the people we cared about most. 6 months later, Dorothy's garden was blooming beautifully. Ryan was making steady progress in his recovery, and our family was learning to love each other in healthier ways. The worst night of my life had ultimately led to the most meaningful transformation any of us had ever experienced. Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and doing what you knew was right? Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when it means watching someone we care about face difficult consequences. I'd love to hear your thoughts about setting boundaries with family members in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or helped you think about your own family relationships differently, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories about the complicated nature of love, accountability, and healing. Don't forget to share this with someone who might need to hear about the importance of choosing justice over enabling, even when it's the hardest choice you'll ever make. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of a community that believes in the power of truth, healing, and second chances. I hope your own journey toward healthier relationships brings you the peace and growth that mine eventually brought to our family.